My name is Jasmine. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described the same way: calm, dependable, so sweet, easy to get along with. I work in project compliance for a mid-sized healthcare company, which is just a polished way of saying I read contracts carefully, notice what other people miss, and make sure small oversights don't become expensive disasters. Most people don't see that part of me. They see the soft voice, the polite smile, the woman who brings the extra dish to Thanksgiving and remembers everyone's dietary restrictions, the one who listens more than she talks, the one who doesn't interrupt. What they don't notice is that I remember everything. This story isn't about screaming matches or dramatic revenge. It's not about exposing secrets at a dinner table or walking away in slow motion while someone begs me to stay. It's about something quieter. It's about the day my in-laws changed the locks on the house I paid for, the house where my name was the only one on the mortgage, and believed that my silence meant surrender. And it's about what happened after. For years, I was the reliable one, the practical one, the financial backbone that didn't ask for credit. I handled paperwork, taxes, repairs, insurance, the invisible infrastructure of a life. My husband's family saw me as helpful, convenient, stable. They did not see me as powerful. When the locks were changed, it wasn't done with shouting, it was done with confidence, with an assumption, with the quiet belief that I would adjust, accommodate, smooth things over like I always had. And for a moment, standing on that porch with my key no longer fitting the door, I understood something very clearly. They didn't think I would do anything about it. This isn't a story about revenge. I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't raise my voice. But I did make decisions. Measured ones, legal ones, final ones. Over the next few months, I learned exactly what silence can build. I learned the difference between being underestimated and being powerless. And I learned that sometimes the most dramatic shift in a family doesn't happen in a fight. It happens in paperwork. If you've ever been seen as the nice one, if you've ever realized too late that your reliability made you invisible, you might understand what it feels like to quietly step out of the role everyone assigned you. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated so deeply that people forgot to ask what you were capable of? To my in-laws, I was the dependable one, not the passionate one, not the emotional one, not even the ambitious one. Dependable. When Daniel and I got married 7 years ago, his parents introduced me to relatives as Jasmine. She works with contracts, she's very organized. It was said with pride, but also with containment. Like, that was the entire summary of me. Organized? It translated into something very specific over time. If paperwork needed reviewing, it came to me. If the insurance company needed to be called, I handled it. If someone forgot to pay a bill, I quietly made sure it was covered. If holiday plans fell apart, I rearranged my schedule to fix them. No one asked whether I wanted to. They assumed I would. Daniel was charming in the way men are when they've never had to be the responsible one. He had ideas, big ones, business concepts that started at the dinner table and dissolved by the following spring. His parents loved that about him. They called it vision. I called it instability, but only in my head. When we bought our house, it was technically our house. That's how it was spoken about. But the mortgage company didn't care about pronouns. Daniel's credit history was inconsistent. Mine wasn't. My income was stable. His fluctuated. So the mortgage was approved under my name alone. I remember the day we signed the papers. Daniel squeezed my hand and joked, "Guess I'm just living in your world now." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But I also noticed something in his mother's expression. A flicker, quick, almost imperceptible, not disapproval, not exactly, adjustment. From that day forward, I became something subtly different in the family ecosystem. Not just the organized one, the useful one. When Daniel's younger sister needed a temporary place to stay after a breakup, it was assumed she could use our guest room. I was informed at Sunday dinner, not asked. "It'll only be for a few weeks," his mother said, smiling at me like I was a reasonable institution rather than a person. I said yes. Of course I did. Because saying no would have required an explanation. And explanations, in that family, were interpreted as resistance. Over time, I noticed the pattern. When there was comfort to be offered, it came from me. When there was a sacrifice to be made, it came from me. When there was space to be given, It came from me. I wasn't mistreated loudly. There were no insults, no cruelty. Just an assumption. At family gatherings, I sat at the edge of conversations about decisions that directly affected my home. Renovations were discussed as if Daniel alone would approve them, his father once said. When you redo the kitchen, and looked only at his son. I was standing right there. Daniel would glance at me briefly, as if to check whether I was bothered. I never was, not visibly, because I had been raised to believe that composure was strength, that reacting emotionally meant losing ground. So I stayed composed. I handled property taxes, I scheduled maintenance, I refinanced the loan when rates dropped, I built equity with steady payments made on time, every time. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, a role formed around me. Reliable, quiet, accommodating, invisible in decision-making, essential in responsibility. They didn't see me as fragile. That would have required attention. They saw me as fixed infrastructure like plumbing or wiring, necessary, but not central to the story of the house. What they never asked was how infrastructure feels when it's treated as permanent. Because permanent things, in their minds, don't leave. And that assumption, more than anything else, is what made the day they changed the locks possible. The first time I felt it clearly not as a passing irritation, but as something sharp was over a door. It wasn't even the front door. It was the garage side entrance. Daniel's father had come over one Saturday afternoon while I was reorganizing the pantry. I remember because I was labeling storage containers, lining them up so expiration dates faced outward. Small order in a world that constantly tried to rearrange itself around me. I heard the metallic sound of tools from the garage. Not unusual. His father liked to improve things. An hour later, he walked into the kitchen, wiping his hands with a rag. "Change that flimsy lock on the side door," he said casually. "The old one wasn't secure." I paused, just slightly. "Oh," I said, "did you need the spare key?" He smiled. The kind of smile older men give when they believe they're being generous with their effort. "No need, I've got it handled." Daniel came in behind him, nodding approvingly. Dad knows what he's doing. That old lock was junk anyway. I waited for the next sentence. It didn't come. There was no, "We'll give you the new keys." No, "Let's make copies." Just the assumption that the update was complete. That night, after his parents left, I walked out to the garage and tried my key. It didn't fit. I stood there longer than necessary. Not because I was locked out, the front door worked fine, but because of what it represented. The house was in my name. The insurance was under my policy. The loan payments came out of my account. And yet, a decision about access had been made without me even being informed beforehand. It would have been easy to frame it as kindness. He was helping, improving security, being proactive. That's what Daniel said when I mentioned it lightly over dinner. "You're overthinking it, Jazz. He was just trying to help." I nodded. Because technically, that's how small cuts work. They arrived disguised as favors. The next morning, I asked Daniel if we could get a copy of the new key made. He looked mildly confused. "Why, we already have the front." "Because I don't like doors in my house that I can't open," I almost said. Instead, I smiled, just in case. He shrugged. "I'll ask Dad next time I see him." Next time came and went. No key appeared. Weeks passed. His sister moved out. Life continued. Holidays were planned. I refinanced the water heater warranty. Daniel started another short-term business idea that required just a little temporary investment, which I covered, as usual, after carefully reviewing the numbers. But every time I walked through the garage and saw that side door, I remembered. It wasn't about control in a dramatic sense. No one was trying to exile me. It was about something subtler. Authority without acknowledgement. I began to notice other versions of the same pattern. Daniel's mother rearranged my kitchen cabinets while helping prepare Thanksgiving dinner. I came home from work one afternoon to find my spice rack alphabetized differently, not wrong, just changed. "Oh, this makes more sense," she said warmly. "I hope you don't mind." I didn't mind, but I heard myself say, "That's fine." Each instance was small enough to dismiss. Each one carried plausible deniability. And because I wasn't someone who reacted loudly, the pattern continued uninterrupted. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension. I told myself families function differently. I told myself that love sometimes looks like overlap. But there's a difference between overlap and erasure. The garage door wasn't the crisis. It was the first quiet indicator that decisions about my own home could happen without my consent, and that everyone involved would consider that normal. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand the key. I simply made a mental note. And if you've ever worked in compliance or survived by observing carefully, you know this. The first note you take is rarely about the incident itself. It's about the pattern forming underneath it. After the garage door, nothing dramatic happened. That's what made it easy to ignore. There were no arguments, no ultimatums, no slammed doors, just a series of small adjustments that slowly recalibrated my position in my own home. Daniel's parents began dropping by more frequently, always with notice, but rarely with a question. We'll swing by around 6. Dad wants to look at the backyard drainage. I told your mother we could host Easter this year. I would hear about these plans the way you hear about weather updates, informational, not negotiable. The first few times, I adjusted my schedule automatically. Left work early, rearranged meetings, cleaned, cooked, prepared. Not because I was ordered to, because I anticipated. That was my strength, and it was also my vulnerability. One Sunday afternoon, I came home from grocery shopping to find Daniel and his father measuring the living room wall. For what I asked gently, setting the bags down. Built-in shelving, his father said, tapping the drywall. It'll add value. Daniel nodded. Dad's got a great design in mind. I stood there, calculating. Built-ins meant drilling, structural assessment, permits, possibly, cost, time. No one had mentioned this to me. I waited for someone to ask what I thought. They didn't. Instead, Daniel turned to me casually. It'll look amazing, right? It wasn't a question. It was a cue. Agree. So I smiled, because disagreement would have required explaining why consultation mattered. Sure, I said. The shelves were installed 2 weeks later. They were well made, beautiful, even. But every time I looked at them, I felt something settle uncomfortably in my chest. Not anger. Displacement. I started noticing how often my input was requested only after a decision had already been emotionally finalized. If I hesitated, I became the obstacle. If I agreed, I reinforced the pattern. So I chose the option that preserved peace. At least, that's what I told myself. In truth, I was rationalizing. I told myself Daniel needed his father's approval. I told myself his mother meant well. I told myself families were collaborative by nature. And I told myself that because the mortgage was in my name, real control still technically rested with me. That was the quiet comfort I carried like an unspoken ace. On paper, I had authority. In practice, I deferred. The two coexisted in a strange balance. Then came a dinner that shifted something, though at the time I didn't fully recognize it. We were at Daniel's parents' house. His uncle was there, along with a few cousins. The topic drifted to property values and smart investments. Daniel's father laughed and said, "Well, Daniel's the visionary. He picked a great house." The table hummed in agreement. No one corrected it. I felt the sentence land not as an insult, but as a rewriting. Daniel hadn't picked the house alone. I had spent months reviewing listings. I had negotiated the price. I had structured the loan. But I watched Daniel accept the credit with a modest smile. And I watched myself say nothing, because correcting it would have embarrassed him. And I don't embarrass people. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment. It wasn't about acknowledgement for ego. It was about authorship. My labor was being absorbed into a collective narrative where I was a supportive background, not a central architect. I could have spoken up. I chose not to. That's the part I'm honest about now. Silence can be dignified. It can also be permission. Over time, I stopped expecting to be consulted first. I started waiting to be informed. I kept paying the mortgage. I kept maintaining the structure. I kept smoothing the friction. And externally, everything looked harmonious. No fights, no tension, no visible cracks. Just a woman who appeared agreeable. What no one realized, not even Daniel, was that I was not unaware. I was observing. And observation, when combined with patience, becomes something far more powerful than reaction. At the time, though, I still believed I could outlast the pattern simply by enduring it. I hadn't yet understood that endurance, without boundaries, quietly trains people how to treat you. There's a moment in every long pattern when you stop reacting to individual incidents and start seeing the script. For me, it happened on a Wednesday night in early October. Daniel's mother had invited herself over, though she would never phrase it that way. She texted him, Thought I'd stop by and drop off some fall decorations. By the time I got home from work, the living room had been transformed. Orange throws draped over the couch I chose. Ceramic pumpkins lined up across the built-in shelves I hadn't approved. A wreath already hung on the front door, not centered. Daniel was standing in the kitchen, amused. "Mom went all out," he said lightly. I walked through the space slowly. Everything was neat, tasteful, seasonal. None of it was mine. His mother appeared from the hallway carrying a box. "Oh, good, you're home," she said warmly. "I wasn't sure which candles you'd prefer, so I just picked something neutral." I looked at the candles in her hands. Neutral. That word echoed. It described more than scent. It described me. Reliable, calm, non-disruptive. Neutral. I thanked her. Of course I did. Because nothing she had done was overtly wrong. She hadn't insulted me. She hadn't demanded anything. She had simply occupied space. Later that night, after she left, I began quietly putting some of the decorations back into their boxes. Not aggressively, not in protest, just restoring proportion. Daniel noticed. "Why are you taking it down? Mom worked hard on that." I paused. "I just like things a little simpler." He sighed, not angrily, but with mild frustration. "You could have just left it. It's not a big deal." And there it was again. "It's not a big deal." That phrase had become the family's protective shield. Anything that unsettled me was minimized before I could even articulate why. It's not a big deal that your opinion wasn't asked. It's not a big deal that plans were made without you. It's not a big deal that credit shifted quietly away from you. Individually, none of it was catastrophic. Collectively, it formed a role. The role was clear. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbs, the one who adjusts, the one who keeps harmony intact. I wasn't the decision maker. I wasn't the center. I was the infrastructure. An infrastructure doesn't complain. It functions. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. Because once you recognize the role you've been assigned, you face a choice. Continue performing it, or step out of it. But stepping out would require friction. It would require redefining myself in a family dynamic that relied on my quiet compliance. I wasn't ready for open disruption. So instead, I did something else. I began observing the mechanics of the role more consciously. When Daniel's father suggested another upgrade, I noticed how quickly Daniel agreed without consulting me. When his mother referenced Daniel's house, I noted the phrasing. When financial discussions came up in group settings, I noticed how often my contribution was assumed rather than acknowledged. I didn't argue. I documented mentally at first. Because here's what I understood. Slowly. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were operating within a story where I was a steady background, and I had participated in writing that story. The dangerous thing about being reliable is that people forget reliability has limits. The more I fulfilled the role flawlessly, the more permanent it seemed. Until one day, permanence would be tested. But at this stage, I was still performing, still paying, still smoothing, still silent. They believed I would always be there, not because they disrespected me maliciously, but because I had never shown them what happened if I wasn't. And the truth is, at that point, I didn't fully know either. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a holiday dinner or after some grand betrayal. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, under fluorescent office lighting, while I was reviewing a contract amendment for work. The document was routine, a vendor requesting expanded access privileges without adjusting liability terms. It was subtle, easy to overlook if you trusted the relationship. But I didn't trust relationships without documentation. I highlighted the clause, drafted a response, and sent it back with clear revisions, calm, professional, precise. An hour later, the vendor replied apologetically. They claimed it was an oversight. They agreed to my terms. Oversight. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the word on the screen. That's when it clicked. In my professional life, I was not neutral. I was not background. I was the gatekeeper, the one who read the fine print, the one who prevented quiet imbalances from becoming permanent liabilities. No one in that office described me as easygoing. They described me as sharp, respected, detail-oriented. Why was I capable of protecting corporate assets worth millions of dollars, but hesitant to protect my own position inside my own home? The question didn't accuse me. It clarified me. That evening, I came home to find Daniel's parents in the driveway. His father was speaking animatedly about converting part of the garage into a small workshop. It'll only take a few weekends, he said. Adds character. Character? I looked at the garage door, the same one whose lock I didn't have a key for, and something inside me settled into place. Not anger, alignment. I didn't interrupt. I didn't object. I simply asked, evenly, have you checked whether that affects the home insurance policy? There was a brief silence. His father waved a hand dismissively. It's just a small modification. I'd like to review the policy before any structural changes, I said calmly, just to make sure coverage stays intact. My tone wasn't sharp. It wasn't emotional. It was professional. Daniel looked at me differently in that moment. Not threatened, not defensive, surprised.
Because I hadn't pushed back before. I had accommodated.
His father nodded slowly. Well, sure, if you think that's necessary. I do, I replied. And that was it. No argument, no tension. But internally, something irreversible had begun. That night, I opened my laptop at the dining table and pulled up our mortgage documents. Not because I had forgotten anything I knew the details, but because I wanted to see them again, with clear eyes. Borrower Jasmine Elise Carter. Sole obligor. Primary insured party. The house wasn't just emotionally mine. It was legally mine. I had allowed the emotional narrative to override the structural reality. That was my choice. And if I had chosen that once, I could choose differently now. The shift wasn't about dominance. It was about authorship. For years, I had operated as if maintaining harmony was the highest virtue. But harmony without boundaries isn't peace. It's a quiet erosion. I didn't confront Daniel that night. I didn't bring up past slights or missed acknowledgements. Instead, I started making small internal adjustments. I would no longer agree automatically. I would no longer defer instinctively. I would pause before answering. And most importantly, I would align my external behavior with the legal and financial reality that already existed. Silence had once been my shield. Now, it would become my strategy. The next time a decision was made without me, the response would not be emotional. It would be structural. And structures, once altered, change everything built on top of them. After that Tuesday, I didn't transform overnight into someone louder. I became quieter. But it was a different kind of quiet. Before, my silence was reflex a smoothing instinct. Now, it was selective. Daniel noticed it first. Not because I challenged him, because I stopped preempting him. When his mother texted about hosting Thanksgiving at our house again, he read it aloud like usual, already assuming the answer. They'll need the guest room Wednesday through Sunday. I looked up from my laptop. Have you told her yes? He hesitated. Not yet. I was about to. Then maybe ask me first, I said gently. There was no edge in my voice. Just a fact. He blinked. Of course, I just figured. I know, I replied. That's the part I'm adjusting. He studied me for a moment, uncertain what that meant. The old version of me would have followed it with reassurance. It's fine. Don't worry. I don't mind. I didn't offer any of that. I let the sentence stand on its own. We did host Thanksgiving, but the planning conversation happened differently. I set boundaries on guest duration. I defined shared responsibilities. I asked Daniel to communicate those details himself. His mother sounded mildly surprised on the phone. Oh, well, of course, dear. Whatever works. The tone was polite, but beneath it, I could feel recalibration. Silence can feel like weakness to people who benefit from your compliance. When you stop filling every gap, they feel the space immediately. A week later, Daniel's father brought up the garage workshop again. I measured it out, he said casually over dinner. It won't interfere with much. I folded my napkin slowly. I reviewed the insurance policy. I said, structural modifications require notification, otherwise, coverage could be reduced. Daniel's father frowned slightly. It's just a hobby space. I understand, I replied evenly, but liability doesn't care about intention. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, just resistance presented as logistics. They weren't used to that. In the past, I would have either agreed or found a compromise before they even felt challenged. Now, I allowed discomfort to sit in the room. Not aggressively, just present. Later that night, Daniel asked, are you upset about something? It was the first time he'd asked directly. I considered lying to preserve ease. Instead, I answered carefully, I'm not upset. I'm becoming more intentional. About what? About where I stand in decisions that affect me. He was quiet for a long moment. You've always had a say. I met his eyes. Have I? The question wasn't accusatory, it was observational. He didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, something else shifted not just in me, but in him. People grow accustomed to your patterns. When you change them calmly, they don't know whether to resist or reconsider. I didn't argue statistics. I didn't recount past moments. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I simply stopped behaving like infrastructure at work. I began organizing digital copies of every home-related document into a secure folder: mortgage statements, insurance policies, tax filings, renovation receipts. Not secretly, deliberately. Preparation isn't paranoia, it's clarity. No one noticed. Why would they? I was still polite, still composed, still Jasmine. But the internal shift was complete. Silence was no longer surrender. It was observation before action. And the people around me, especially Daniel's parents, mistook the lack of visible emotion for continued compliance. They didn't understand that quiet, when paired with documentation and legal standing, becomes something formidable. They thought I was soft. They had never seen me strategic. And strategy doesn't announce itself. It waits. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After my internal shift, I didn't make grand declarations. I didn't threaten change. I didn't even change my tone. I changed my habits. First, I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor, not because we were in crisis, but because I wanted a full review of my personal exposure. I framed it to Daniel as long-term planning. He agreed easily. He always trusted me with numbers. During that meeting, I asked very specific questions. If a property is solely under one name, what are the procedural steps for occupancy disputes? If non-owners reside in the home temporarily, what rights do they acquire? What documentation protects primary ownership if access is altered without consent? The advisor didn't seem surprised by the questions. He answered clinically, neutral, informative. Nothing illegal, nothing extreme, just clarity. I left that office with a list of options I hoped I would never need. Then I requested a full copy of our home insurance file, including past claims and modification disclosures. I reviewed them at the dining table one evening while Daniel watched television. "What are you working on?" he asked casually. "Just organizing," I said, which was true. I created both digital and physical copies of every key document. I stored one set in my black leather portfolio, another in a secure cloud folder under my sole access credentials. At work, this would have been considered standard protocol. At home, it was invisible. Meanwhile, small behaviors around me continued as if nothing had shifted. Daniel's mother still referred to it as Daniel's house in conversation. His father still made offhand comments about future upgrades. And one afternoon, I came home to find a new keypad lock installed on the front door. I stood very still when I saw it. It was sleek, modern, black matte finish. Daniel was in the kitchen. "Surprise," he said. "Dad found a great deal on smart locks. No more fumbling with keys." I walked to the door and examined the keypad. "What's the access code?" I asked calmly. "Oh, I set one up already. It's easy to remember." He recited a 6-digit number. It was his childhood home address. "Not ours." I nodded slowly. "Does anyone else have the code?" "Just Mom and Dad," he said, "in case of emergencies." "Emergencies?" I absorbed that word carefully. "I'd like my own code," I replied. He looked puzzled. "Why, we can all use the same one." "Because access logs track entries by code," I said evenly. "If something ever happens, individual codes are clearer." He stared at me for a second, that look again. The one where he recalibrated his understanding of me. "Okay," he said finally. "I can add one for you. I didn't mention that as the sole name on the mortgage. I technically didn't need permission for access control. I didn't escalate. I simply ensured documentation existed. Over the next few weeks, I began paying attention to something else: patterns of presence. When his parents visited, how long did they stay? When they let themselves in, did they inform us first? How often were changes made without discussion? I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was mapping behavior. And quietly, I adjusted my financial structure. I opened a separate high-yield savings account in my name, a loan not hidden, but not advertised. I rerouted a portion of my paycheck there. I reviewed our joint expenditures and identified which ones were discretionary versus essential. Preparation isn't dramatic, it's patient. No one noticed because I didn't behave differently socially. I still attended dinners, I still smiled, I still listened. But internally, I was repositioning. And here's the truth, I wasn't planning to leave. Not yet. I was planning for the possibility that one day a line would be crossed so clearly that I wouldn't hesitate. Most people assume power shows up loudly in arguments, ultimatums, visible standoffs. But real leverage builds quietly, document by document, account by account, observation by observation. They believed my silence meant stability. They didn't realize that silence can also mean calculation. And when the moment came, the one that changed everything, I would not need to scramble. Because what they never noticed was that I had already moved 3 steps ahead. The private reveal didn't come from confrontation. It came from a letter. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a plain white envelope from the mortgage servicer. I almost left it unopened on the counter. I pay everything on time. There are rarely surprises. But something made me open it immediately. Inside was a notification request form. A third party had inquired about adding authorized access to the mortgage account. Not to refinance, not to assume liability, just to gain informational privileges. The name listed under the request wasn't Daniel's. It was his father's. I read the form twice to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting it. He hadn't been granted access. It was just an inquiry. The servicer required my written authorization to proceed. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confirmation. The garage lock, the smart keypad, the workshop plans, the casual references to Daniel's house. It wasn't random. It was a trajectory. I sat down at the kitchen table and let the realization settle slowly. They weren't trying to take the house from me. They were positioning themselves as if my role were administrative, not authoritative. As if, over time, the distinction would blur enough that ownership felt communal. That's how lines get crossed without anyone noticing the moment it happens. I didn't call Daniel immediately. I didn't confront his father. Instead, I logged into the mortgage portal and reviewed account activity. Nothing unusual. No missed payments. No suspicious changes. Then I did something small but definitive. I added multi-factor authentication tied solely to my personal device and email. I updated the account security questions answers only I would know. Not out of paranoia, out of alignment. Then I called the mortgage company directly. Can you confirm, I asked evenly, that no access changes can be made without my notarized consent? Yes, ma'am, the representative replied. You are the sole borrower. No modifications occur without your authorization. Sole borrower? Hearing it spoken aloud did something inside me. It clarified the power dynamic in a way no family conversation ever had. After the call, I sat very still. This was the private reveal. Not that they were plotting something dramatic, but they felt entitled to proximity with my financial structure without consulting me. And here's what mattered most. If I had still been the earlier version of myself, I would have rationalized it. Maybe Dad was just trying to help. Maybe Daniel mentioned something casually. It's not a big deal. But this time, I didn't minimize it. I didn't inflate it either. I simply recognized it for what it was, an attempted expansion of influence without direct conversation. That evening, when Daniel came home, I showed him the letter calmly. He frowned as he read it. I didn't know he did this, he said quickly. I believe you, I replied. And I did. Daniel's flaw wasn't manipulation. It was passivity. He let his parents move into spaces without noticing the boundaries dissolving. I'm not authorizing it, I said evenly. Of course not, he answered. There was an awkward pause. Then he added, Dad probably thought it would be easier if he could check statements when he helps with projects. Helps with projects? There it was again, the quiet assumption of shared control. I don't need help managing the mortgage, I said softly. The sentence wasn't sharp. It was factual. Daniel nodded slowly, and for the first time, I saw something like realization cross his face. Not about the letter, about me. About the fact that I was no longer absorbing these moments as harmless. Later that night, I filed the letter in my portfolio under a new tab. I labeled simply, Access. That was the private reveal. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just clarity. They had begun adjusting locks and codes in small ways, believing the structure itself was emotionally negotiable. What they didn't fully understand yet was that the structure was legally precise. And once I stopped confusing emotional harmony with legal authority, everything shifted. Quietly, irreversibly. The day they changed the locks, it wasn't raining, it wasn't dramatic, there was no storm, no cinematic soundtrack. It was bright, ordinary suburban. I had stayed late at work, finishing a quarterly compliance report. When I pulled into the driveway just after 7, I noticed Daniel's parents' car parked slightly crooked near the curb. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the front door. The matte black keypad had been replaced. Not upgraded, replaced. I walked up the steps slowly, my heels quiet against the concrete. The new lock was silver bulkier, unfamiliar, no keypad. Just a keyhole. I reached into my bag and pulled out my house key. It didn't fit. I tried again, adjusting the angle. Nothing. There's a specific sound metal makes when it refuses entry. A dull resistance. Final. I stood there for a full 5 seconds before ringing the doorbell. Daniel opened it. "Oh," he said, "surprised, you're back." I held up the key. "It doesn't work." "Yeah," he said, stepping aside. "Dad switched the lock this afternoon. The smart one was glitching." "Glitching?" "And I wasn't told I asked evenly." He hesitated. "I thought Mom texted you." She hadn't. I stepped inside. His parents were in the living room, mid-conversation about paint samples. His father looked up. "We had to change it quickly. The keypad was unreliable." "I see," I replied calmly. "Where's my new key?" There was a pause, brief but measurable. "Oh," his mother said lightly. "We only made a couple of copies so far. Daniel has one." I looked at Daniel. He avoided my eyes for half a second. "We were going to get you one tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow?" I stood in the center of the entryway, in the house I legally owned without a key. It would have been easy to raise my voice, to say something sharp, to accuse. Instead, I asked one question. "Who else has keys?" His father answered without hesitation. "Your mother-in-law and I, of course, in case we need to check on things." "In case we need to check on things?" I nodded slowly. No one seemed to grasp the gravity of what had just happened. They weren't trying to exile me, that much was clear. They simply didn't consider it urgent that I retain independent access to property under my sole name. Because in their narrative, I was a stable infrastructure. Permanent. Accommodating. I walked into the kitchen, set my bag down, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. Inside, something finalized. This wasn't about the lock. It was about consent. About authority being assumed rather than requested. I had options. Option 1. Confront them immediately, demand a key, escalate. Option 2. Minimize it, accept the tomorrow key and move on. Option 3. Do nothing visible and act structurally. I chose the irreversible one. Not divorce, not eviction, structure. That night, after everyone left, I sat at the dining table with my portfolio open. I reviewed state property statutes regarding access interference. I reread the occupancy guidelines. I drafted a short, neutral email to myself documenting the date and time of the lock change and the fact that I had not been provided a key upon arrival. Not dramatic, just factual. Then I did something else. I scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney for the following week. Not to file anything, to understand everything. Because once someone changes the locks on property you legally own even casually, the dynamic has shifted into territory that requires precision. Daniel noticed my laptop was open late. "Are we okay?" he asked quietly. I looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," I said, "we are." And in a way, that was true. We were no longer operating on assumptions. We were operating on reality. They had changed the locks. I was about to change the future, but not loudly, not emotionally. Structurally, and once structure moves, it doesn't ask permission to be understood. The attorney's office was smaller than I expected. Second floor, frosted glass door, neutral carpet, the kind of place that doesn't advertise drama-only procedure. I arrived 5 minutes early with my black leather portfolio in hand. When I explained the situation, I didn't embellish, I didn't speculate about motives, I simply laid out facts. Sole borrower on the mortgage, primary name on the deed. Lock changed without prior notice. No immediate key provided. A third-party inquiry was previously made to access the mortgage account. The attorney listened without interruption. When I finished, she folded her hands and asked one question. "Do you feel unsafe, or do you feel disregarded?" The distinction mattered. "Disregarded," I answered. She nodded. "Then this is about boundaries, not emergency removal." "Exactly." She outlined my options clearly. I could formally restrict access to non-owners through a written notice. I could change the locks myself and define key distribution legally. I could establish occupancy agreements if extended family members stayed beyond temporary visits. I could restructure financial contributions to clarify ownership boundaries. Nothing extreme, nothing theatrical, just alignment between law and lived reality. I didn't act immediately, I waited. Because strategy isn't about reacting to the first discomfort, it's about choosing the moment that defines the pattern. A week later, the tomorrow key still hadn't materialized. I didn't ask again. Instead, I scheduled a locksmith. Midday, while Daniel was at work. When the locksmith arrived, I handed him proof of ownership without hesitation. He verified the documents, replaced the lock, and handed me 3 keys. "One for you, 2 spares," he said. "Thank you," I replied calmly. I didn't announce it. That evening, Daniel came home and paused at the door. "The lock's different," he said. "Yes," I answered. "I had it replaced." He stared at me. "Why?" "Because I didn't have a key." Silence stretched between us. "I was going to get one made," he said. It had been 8 days. My tone wasn't sharp. It was measured. I handed him one of the spare keys. "You have access," I said, "but access won't be assumed anymore." He looked at the key in his hand as if it carried more weight than metal should. "What about Mom and Dad?" he asked carefully. "If they need to visit, they can ring the doorbell." There was no anger in my voice, just finality. The next step was subtler. I separated the mortgage payments from our joint account and began transferring them directly from my personal account. Not hidden, transparent. When Daniel noticed, he asked about it. "It simplifies tracking," I said, "since it's under my name." He didn't argue, because technically, I was right. I also drafted a short, formal document clarifying that any extended stays beyond 14 days required written agreement from the homeowner. I didn't present it aggressively. I emailed it to Daniel and said, "For clarity moving forward." He read it slowly. "You're serious?" he murmured. "Yes. And here's the thing, I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't trying to hurt his parents. I was restoring structural accuracy to match legal reality. The consequences weren't visible yet. No one had panicked. No one had apologized. But something had changed. For the first time since we bought the house, the invisible infrastructure had asserted itself. Quietly, procedurally, irrevocably, they had changed the locks without thinking. I had changed the framework with intention. And frameworks don't require raised voices. They require signatures. The first consequence wasn't dramatic. It was an inconvenience. 3 days after I replaced the lock, Daniel's mother showed up mid-morning with a casserole dish, something about just dropping by. She rang the doorbell. She rang it again. I watched from the upstairs office window before walking down. When I opened the door, she smiled, but there was a flicker of confusion behind it. "Oh," she said lightly, "we couldn't get in." "I know," I replied calmly. She held up the dish. "I figured I'd let myself in like usual. Please call ahead next time," I said. "It's easier." The sentence wasn't hostile, but it was new. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, of course." She stepped inside when I invited her, but the dynamic had shifted. She glanced at the lock once more, as if trying to decode what it symbolized. It wasn't about metal. It was about access. Later that evening, Daniel received a call from his father. I wasn't trying to overhear, but the house carries sound differently when tension exists. "Why were the locks changed without telling us?" his father asked. Daniel's voice was lower than usual. "It's Jasmine's name on the house," he said carefully. "She wanted to update things." "Update things?" I didn't correct the phrasing. It didn't need correction. The next consequence was subtler financial. Daniel noticed that the mortgage payment no longer came out of the joint account. "I thought we split everything," he said one night while reviewing transactions. "We split shared expenses," I replied. "The mortgage is my liability." "Are you saying it's not our house anymore?" "It's always been legally mine," I said gently. "Emotionally, it's ours. Structurally, it's different." He didn't like that answer, but he couldn't dispute it. What they were feeling wasn't punishment. It was recalibration. When people grow accustomed to access, the removal of automatic entry feels like rejection, even when it's simply a boundary. At Sunday dinner that week, the atmosphere was different. Polite, controlled, his father mentioned casually. "It would have been nice to know about the lock change." I met his eyes. "It would have been nice to know about the last one." The table went still. No shouting, no escalation, just equilibrium. His mother shifted in her seat. "Well, we were just trying to help." "I understand," I said calmly, "and I'm just maintaining clarity." Clarity? That word replaced harmony in my vocabulary. Over the next few weeks, visits became scheduled instead of assumed. Text messages replaced surprise appearances. Conversations included me earlier in the process. No one apologized explicitly, but behavior adjusted. Daniel was quieter, too, not resentful, reflective. One evening, he said, "I didn't realize how much you were carrying." "I didn't either." I answered honestly. Because here's the truth when you operate as infrastructure. You normalize weight. It doesn't feel heavy until you set it down. The consequences weren't explosive. They were cumulative. Access reduced, assumptions challenged, narratives corrected. And beneath it all, something else was happening. They were beginning to understand that I wasn't passive. I had been patient. There's a difference. Patience waits. Passivity yields. When patience decides to move, it doesn't argue. It rearranges the environment. And slowly, the environment around us was rearranging itself. The panic didn't arrive in the form of shouting. It arrived as an urgency. 2 months after the lock change, Daniel's father called him late on a Thursday evening. I could hear the tension in his voice even from across the room. "What do you mean we can't stay next month?" he demanded. Daniel glanced at me before answering. "Jasmine sent the occupancy agreement," he said carefully. "It's just formalizing things." Formalizing things? That phrase had started unsettling them more than any argument would have. The issue was simple on the surface. Daniel's parents wanted to stay for 3 weeks while renovations were happening in their own home. In the past, that request would have been automatic. Guest room ready, no paperwork, no questions. But now there was a document. Clear terms, duration limits, liability clauses, a polite note that extended occupancy required homeowner authorization. Not Daniel's. Mine. His mother called me directly the next morning. "Jasmine," she began, her voice unusually tight. "We're family. Why are you treating us like tenants?" I didn't react to the emotion. "I'm not," I said calmly. "I'm treating the property responsibly. We've always had an open-door understanding. I've adjusted that understanding." Silence stretched across the line. It wasn't anger I heard next. It was a realization. Because the agreement wasn't just about paperwork, it was about redefining authority in writing. And once something is written, it stops being negotiable through tone. Daniel struggled in the middle. "I feel like this is escalating," he told me one night. "It's clarifying," I replied. "They think you're pushing them away. I'm pushing boundaries into visibility." He sat down across from me at the dining table, the same table where I'd reviewed insurance policies and drafted notes. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked quietly. I looked at him for a long moment. I did, just not loudly. That was the part that hurt him. Not that I had acted, that I had endured quietly first. The real panic began when they realized something else, because I had separated the mortgage payments and restructured the financial flow. Daniel's discretionary spending tightened. The safety cushion that once blurred ownership had thinned. His father offered to help contribute more directly. I declined. "Financial contribution doesn't equal authority," I said evenly. That sentence landed harder than anything else. They weren't being evicted. They weren't being attacked. They were being repositioned, and repositioning feels like a loss when you've grown comfortable standing at the center. At Sunday dinner, the atmosphere was fragile. His mother avoided eye contact. His father spoke less. Finally, he cleared his throat. "If we've overstepped, that wasn't the intention. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement we would ever receive." "I know," I said calmly. And I meant it. They hadn't set out to undermine me. They had simply grown accustomed to a version of me that absorbed everything without recalibration. The problem wasn't malice. It was momentum. And momentum, once interrupted, cannot simply resume as if nothing shifted. They tried, briefly, to soften things. Extra politeness, careful phrasing, delayed suggestions instead of immediate plans. But by then, the structure had changed. Locks replaced, accounts secured, legal clarity established. Even if I had wanted to revert, I couldn't. Because once you assert authorship over your own environment, stepping backward feels dishonest. The panic wasn't explosive. It was quiet. The realization that the version of me they relied on, the endlessly accommodating one, was no longer available. And by the time they understood that fully, it was already too late to fix it with a simple apology or a spare key. Structures, once reinforced, don't dissolve because someone feels uncomfortable. They hold. The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon. No raised voices, No slammed doors, no audience. Just the four of us sitting in my living room, the built-in shelves behind us, the neutral couch centered beneath the window. Daniel had asked for the meeting. I agreed. His parents sat close together, not defensive, exactly, but aligned. His father spoke first. We need to understand what changed, he said evenly, because from where we're standing, it feels like we've been shut out. The word choice was intentional. Shut out! I folded my hands in my lap. No one is shut out, I replied. Access is simply structured now. His mother leaned forward slightly. We've always treated this house like family space. I understand. I said, but legally, it's my responsibility. That hasn't changed. What's changed is that I'm acting accordingly. Silence. Daniel looked between us like someone watching a negotiation he didn't realize he was part of. His father exhaled slowly. If we made you feel sidelined, that wasn't our intention. There it was again. Intention. I don't doubt your intention, I said calmly, but impact matters more. No one flinched. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused. I had simply stated a principle. His mother's eyes softened slightly. You never said you were unhappy. I wasn't unhappy. I replied, I was unconsulted. That distinction seemed to land. Daniel shifted in his seat. I should have handled things differently, he said quietly. I didn't realize how often I deferred. I looked at him not triumphantly, not resentfully, just honestly. I let it happen, I said. That's on me too. Because this wasn't about villainizing anyone. It was about ending a pattern. His father nodded slowly. So where do we stand now? The question wasn't challenging. It was genuine. We stand with clarity, I said. Visits are welcome, support is welcome, but decisions about the property go through me, not around me. No one argued, because there was nothing irrational about that sentence. The house fell quiet for a moment. The built-in shelves, once a symbol of being overlooked, now felt like part of a room I fully occupied. His mother spoke again, more softly. We didn't realize you felt invisible. I held her gaze. I didn't realize I was allowing it. That was the closest we came to emotional vulnerability. No tears, no dramatic reconciliation, just acknowledgement. Daniel reached for my hand, not performative, not apologetic, steady. The confrontation didn't end in hugs or sweeping promises. It ended in understanding. Not a perfect understanding, but enough. As they left that afternoon, his father paused at the door. Next time we suggest something, he said, we'll start with you. I nodded once. That's all I needed. When the door closed, the house felt different. Not because anyone had been defeated, but because the hierarchy had been corrected without humiliation. There's a specific kind of power in staying calm while the narrative shifts around you. It doesn't burn. It settles. And once it settles, it doesn't need to flare again. If you walked into my house today, you wouldn't see evidence of a battle. There are no cracks in the walls, no lingering tension in the air, no dramatic absence of people who once filled the space. Daniel's parents still visit. They call first. They knock. And when they step inside, they look at me, not over me. The house hasn't changed much physically. The built-in shelves are still there. The couch is the same neutral shade. The front door lock is simple and solid. But I move differently inside these walls. Not louder, not harder, clearer. The biggest shift wasn't external, it was internal. I no longer confuse calmness with compliance. For years, I thought strength meant absorbing discomfort quietly to maintain peace. I believed that because I could handle the weight, I should. Now I understand something different. Just because you can carry something doesn't mean it's yours to hold. Daniel has changed too, not drastically, but meaningfully. He asks before assuming. He pauses before agreeing to plans. When someone references his house, he corrects them gently. It's Jasmine's mortgage, he'll say lightly. We make decisions together. It's a small sentence, but it rewrites the narrative in real time. I didn't demand that shift. I created the conditions for it. There's a difference. I still work in compliance. I still review contracts with a careful eye. But now I apply the same standards to my personal life that I apply professionally. Clarity over comfort, documentation over assumption, boundaries over silent resentment. And here's what surprises people when they hear this story. I don't resent my in-laws. They weren't monsters. They weren't plotting to take anything from me. They were simply operating inside a pattern I helped establish. The moment I stopped performing that pattern, they had to adapt. Some people think quiet dominance is about control. It's not. It's about alignment. My behavior now matches my position. My tone matches my authority. My presence matches my contribution. I no longer shrink to make others comfortable in spaces I built. And that change has rippled beyond the house. At work, I negotiate more confidently. With friends, I express preferences without apology. Even in small moments, choosing where to eat, how to spend a weekend, I notice that I don't default to whatever works for you. Because I matter in the equation. The version of me who stood on that porch, key in hand, locked out of a house under her own name, she wasn't weak. She was unfinished. She hadn't yet reconciled her legal authority with her emotional restraint. Now I have. I am still calm, still measured, still composed. But I am no longer infrastructure. I am the homeowner, not just on paper, but in posture. And once you experience that shift, that quiet redefinition of yourself, you don't go back to being background in your own story. You take up space without raising your voice. When people hear the title of this story, my in-laws locked me out of the house. I was the only one on the mortgage. They expect a dramatic ending. A screaming match, a permanent cut-off, a revenge moment. That's not what happened. They changed the locks. I changed the future. Not with anger, not with humiliation, not with destruction, with alignment. Here's what I learned. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes wrapped in helpfulness, in assumptions, in it's not a big deal. And sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what others do, it's what we normalize. I normalized being unconsulted. I normalized being the stable one who adjusts. I normalized absorbing decisions that affected me. Until one day, I didn't. And the moment I stopped performing invisibility, the dynamic had to evolve. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering people. It's about knowing where you stand legally, emotionally, structurally, and behaving in alignment with that truth. It's about understanding that peace without boundaries is just delayed resentment. And it's about realizing that you don't have to explode to be taken seriously. You can document, you can clarify, you can restructure, you can remain calm while the foundation shifts beneath assumptions that never served you. Today, my in-laws respect my space. Daniel respects my position. And most importantly, I respect myself in a way I didn't before. Because I learned that being the nice one should never mean being the invisible one. So I want to leave you with this. Have you ever found yourself quietly carrying more than your share simply because you were capable of it? And if you stopped tomorrow, what would shift? I'd really like to hear your story.